Welcome to TechVets, the podcast, a show dedicated to exploring the world of tech and cybersecurity through the eyes of industry leaders and ex-forces personnel. In this show, we're marking Remembrance 2021. Joining us is TechVets Ambassador General Sir Richard Barrons, who is former Commander of Joint Forces Command, and Alistair Halliday, CEO of the RFEA, the Forces Employment Charity. Welcome, all of you. Can I start with you, Sir Richard? Remembrance. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think there's both a general and a personal angle to remembrance. The first thing is the country needs to remember that it has fought many wars in its past, and it will fight wars again in its future. And Remembrance Day is a moment when we can reflect on the cost of war, its general folly, and remind ourselves that although sometimes it is necessary, it's never to be undertaken lightly, and the consequences are always terrible at an individual and often at a societal level. And at a personal level, for people like me who spent 40 years in uniform, it's an opportunity to remember my own friends and comrades who either died or suffered life-changing injuries in the various campaigns I took part in.
Alistair, is it always a solemn memorial, or is there any message of hope there too?
I think it's always a very sort of moving time of the year. I mean, there are elements of remembrance which do happen at other times of the year, but I think it's the one time when the whole nation sort of comes together to reflect on it. From the leadership from the royal family and the number of people who actually go to the event on actually Remembrance Sunday. So I think it is right that it is a time to look back and reflect and consider all the sacrifices done by so many in these various conflicts. And it isn't just about the First and Second World Wars, although that has been quite a focus. It has been on those conflicts much more recently, and even those who've actually lost their lives not actually on operations. So I think it has to be a time for sort of somber reflection, but also in a very positive way as well. And I think it's become part of the national psyche when you look at the year, when you come out of the end of the summer, and I always think it's quite an interesting indicator. You have the last night of the proms in Albert Hall, and then 6 weeks later is the Festival of Remembrance, which is a really very moving thing which gets people together. But I completely agree with Sir Richard. There are things to remember from perhaps a more sort of professional level, but also they all brings back personal recollections of our own friends and colleagues and comrades who have actually we've lost. So I think it's a very moving period.
I mean, you're the head of the RFEA, which looks after veterans after their service. I mean, is it as important to them as it is to serving personnel? Is it a national? Is it a national commemoration? Which of those do you see it as mainly?
I think it is very much a national thing. I mean, clearly, when people are serving, it's a major thing. I mean, I was just reflecting on my memories of Remembrance Sundays I've done in various ports around the world, around the UK, and laying wreaths and everything. We've got memories of that. So it's quite a major thing. But I think perhaps when you're a veteran, looking back, it perhaps has even more resonance when you're looking back and just reflecting on some of the operations you've been on and some of the friends and people that have laid down their lives. So I think it is a very, very strong emotion, I think, which comes about.
I think that's a really important point. I think it is a national, it's a national event, but at the same time, especially for those that have served, it becomes very personal. Because of the experiences that people have had, and before I joined, my family have always been big in remembrance and remembering those from the Great Wars, and that had a very huge impact on how we approached conflict since then. But then once I'd served, I think back to my first operational deployment into Afghanistan, and we lost a number of people. The average age of those lost was 23. 3 of them only 19 years old. And when you have that sort of impact in your life, I think it becomes a very personal event.
So I think there's a very important point about the different way people appreciate mortality as they go through life. So the services average age is somewhere around 23. And, as James has described, many are much younger. And when you're 19, you think you're immortal and life just stretches ahead of you in a way that will seem to go on forever. And it won't. So when you're that age and you are confronted by remembrance, it ought to remind you that life really is fragile and there really are consequences. And I think there's a particular digital age point here, is that so many young people now are of the gaming age. So they're used to engaging in things where you get killed theoretically, but then you magically get recreated. And it breeds this sense that there aren't fatal consequences to some actions. And I think being confronted by the reality of remembrance, where they are thinking about their forebears in their services who didn't make it back, ought to remind them that they're not immortal. And then I think for the veteran community who are further down the road of life, they're probably more aware of the mortality. They will absolutely appreciate that the people that they left behind when they were serving didn't have the rest of their lives to enjoy, and it had consequences for their family. And it will certainly make them think hard about why you go to war in the future, and that it should only ever be a last resort.
I also wonder whether some of those veterans as well, I mean, how many of those veterans, it's very difficult to understand the number, but how many have had issues, how many have had difficulties with mental health, PTSD, etc., having had very difficult experiences in their time. And remembrance is a way in which they can come back together with people of a similar ilk, with the military community, to remember those, to sort of confront that PTSD, that sort of catastrophic moment in their life, together with people that they know and love and cherish. I suppose I wonder how important it is for them in that regard.
Perhaps it is. It's the key. It's just such a sort of focus, and I think that one of the major things for veterans to be able to do is the sort of comradeship, and way before people get into more complex, needing clinical support. I think an awful lot of good happens when, frankly, veterans get together, chat, and I think around this sort of period of remembrance. I mean, some of the parades, people get together, go and have a glass of rum or so afterwards. It's great for that reuniting comradeship bit, which is really good, very good for their soul. But as you say, James, and sadly, there are quite a few who actually need more support in the mental health space, and whether it's in terms of acute PTSD or whatever. But I think so. Whilst we perhaps reflect and say, it is one of the more somber periods of the year, it's also worth saying that it's great time for people to get together again and meet up and chat as they remember old mates and colleagues and shipmates or whatever. But also reunite and get together again. So there's a positive side to it too.
What does it do for the wider community, for those who haven't served, Alistair?
Well, it's a good question, actually, because I think there are many people who perhaps don't have that many links with the armed forces today. It does resonate with them. I remember sometimes, going back years ago when I was at school, that was the sort of time when actually there was no silence. There was no sort of 2-minute silence. If you remember, it started off, and then I think the country got out of the habit of it. So although, were there more people who understood it then? I think there was a period where we were starting to get worried that not enough people really understood what it meant. More recently, I think due to Afghanistan and Iraq, the number of casualties which we took, that increased the perception of armed forces in the public eye. And many campaigns, whether in the start of things like Help for Heroes and the Sons campaign. So I think the positioning of the armed forces and the sacrifice was suddenly became a major thing. So 10, 12 years ago. So the last few years, what's slightly worrying, perhaps, we've seen a reduction in that, or it's not reducing down to a minimal level, but it is slightly on the wane. And I think it's very important for those of us who do really believe and take this seriously to make sure we do talk about it and hopefully to retain. But I'm a chair of governors of school. Schools are really all over this now, and perhaps more so than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago. So that's positive.
So I think we should be pretty clear about the politics of today. If you look at the business of defence and security, in our country, it generally ranks below don't know as an issue at a general election. Yeah. Very few people in our country have any sense of existential peril. They're not afraid of invasion or civil war. They're actually not much afraid of their daily life becoming too uncomfortable, as we've just seen with the petrol crisis. And they may have a family connection to a veteran or a relative that died in the First or Second World War. That may mean something. But as first described, when the nation isn't committed to military operations that incur casualties, it slips a long way away from the public consciousness. And I suppose we should see that as natural and to some degree, a healthy thing. Where it isn't healthy is that as the business of war slips away from the public conscience, it makes the idea of going to war somehow fresh or new or even glamorous, because people haven't got in mind the consequences of having gone to war in the past. And therefore, the temptation to fight or to resort to force in some degrees becomes easier if you don't pay enough attention to remembrance. And I'm not arguing that we should shy away from this in any way. And the reason I argue for that is that we are used to an act of remembrance that is focused perhaps on the First or Second World Wars and the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan of late. And yet we still have no sense of peril. The world that our politicians and academics are describing to us is about a world that has far greater peril in it. The rise of a world which is battling against its own planet, where the safety or sense of certainty that a US-led era gave us for about 30 years, all of that is evaporating. And it is very much more likely that the generations alive today will be confronted by existential level risk in their lifetimes, for which in some cases it may be necessary to fight. And if we think about that, that means that we should focus more on remembrance, so that if we have to fight, it's done for the right reasons, because it is essential or inevitable or unavoidable, and not undertaken lightly just because we forgot about the consequences of wars in the past.
So remembrance is a kind of social insurance policy that we should take part in to keep us on a sort of social straight and narrow. Would you go further and say that it also adds to a sense of respect within society because of the way wider society feels about former and serving personnel?
Well, I think that the most important point thing is remembrance should be part of our cultural fabric. It's part of understanding the reality of the world that we live in and the nature of mankind. Mankind fights. I mean, people will argue that we could grow out of it, but as a species, we clearly haven't yet. So the first thing is everybody needs to think about war at some point as part of their education and their political life. So the fact that schools focus on remembrance is a very, very good thing. The second thing, which is more particular to the armed forces, is to recognize that when we send people to fight, and let's remember, big wars that matter, are always won by civilians. They're not won by the regular armed forces. They're sort of too small and they get the thing started. But the price paid in the big wars in our history are men and women who leave their jobs and their families and their villages and their towns and their way of life, and they go to fight. And then when the war is over, they go back to their normal existence. And they bring with them all the consequences of having had to undertake that fight. So there should always be great respect for those people who have gone to fight, but we should recognize that respect is about respecting our own society, the many civilians who go to fight. It's not just about the recent experience of our regular forces. And it should certainly stimulate the thought that fighting always has consequences, mental and physical and institutional, and in the terms of the livelihood of families, that the way they thought they lead their life is torn apart because someone went to fight. And we have to recognize, if we're going to fight, we have to pay the price. We have to live with those consequences and look after the people who fought. That is the price of having to fight, and it's non-negotiable.
James, can I be a little bit of a devil's advocate and just ask you to continue that point, but down the line of it felt like Alice was saying 12 years ago, Remembrance perhaps was different to what it is now. And it certainly felt like we went through a period where Remembrance was being used by government to popularise what many people consider to be unpopular actions overseas. Have we got Remembrance back on the right track for wider society, do you think?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I would refute that idea to an extent, because I think I don't necessarily think the government were trying to popularise something. But what I do think they were doing was carrying on the tradition where there was a substantial rise in counter narratives, counter arguments in the media, which clearly, in today's society can pick up momentum very, very quickly through social media platforms. But I think Remembrance has always been a fairly steady beast. I can't remember a time where there haven't been events all around the UK leading up to and during the actual immediate period of Remembrance. I think it's strong. I think what is increasingly strong now is the sense of community. Especially coming off the back of the pandemic, people have realised that looking out for one another is something that is quite important. We have that in abundance within the military community. And now there are so many organisations and platforms for veterans to engage on that actually I think the whole of the military community is coming together stronger than ever, generally speaking. I think the government are starting to appreciate that the people involved in these conflicts, the military people involved in these conflicts, they don't decide to do it themselves. The people are the same. The general population realise that Private Joe Bloggs has no political inclination to go and fight a war somewhere on their own right. They're doing their job for what they feel is right. And I think we went through that period with the Afghan and Iraq conflicts where we had that step change, where it stopped being about everyone involved in the military is wrong for these conflicts, and it was maybe the wrong political decision. That was the argument, and the people involved were just people involved, and we should still remember them. There was still a sacrifice, there was still a loss that wasn't just felt within the military community, the family, the friends, the relatives, and that starts spanning out into a wider civilian community. And I think the strength there was kind of regained quite nicely if we did ever lose it. And I don't really feel like we lost the strength of Remembrance, to be honest. I think the narrative was just changing on the surface.
I think there's always a danger that Remembrance gets pulled in one or both of two unfortunate directions. The first is it gets pulled into the glorification of war, which is just a terrible idea, and I don't think it's really prevalent in the UK. And equally unfortunate is it gets conflated with pacifism, because it isn't about pacifism. I think what Remembrance recognises is war is truly terrible. It should be the last resort, but it is sometimes unavoidable and necessary in the way that mankind has developed, and so it should provoke a thoughtful reflection on the business of fighting and its consequences. But it should not result in saying we will never fight, because we surely will, particularly in the world we're going to move into, and it absolutely should not dissolve into some glorification of war that makes it more tempting or seen as a good thing. And I don't think that's very prevalent, but it should be stamped on if it appears.
Alistair, I'm feeling that both Sir Richard and James are defining Remembrance, which is terribly important. I'm going to look to you to give me some hope that Remembrance has changed a little bit over time, and I wondered if you would agree that it is used as a platform to you talked about Remembrance as being as changing throughout your life. Are we now seeing it as a platform, for example, to talk about the welfare of veterans, which is one of your big subjects, and of course is one of James's big subjects?
I mean, I think Remembrance is a very strong thing anyway. And I say when it's changed slightly, that's more the way perhaps it was delivered and in the past compared to it has been, say, 10 years ago and now. And I also think, I'm not saying it should be a platform. I mean, perhaps I wouldn't use that sort of language. I think it's something which is a very much part of our national psyche, and we we think that's the right thing, and long may that continue. I suppose, is it something which then is an opportunity or a moment to reflect more widely on serving armed forces personnel and some of the issues? Yes, it probably is, because I think probably for many people across the country who don't really spend much time thinking or considering people in the armed forces, it probably does act as this is the time of year when it's out everywhere, Royal British Legion, the poppies. And so for some people who are quite distant from it, from the armed forces, it probably then gives an opportunity to consider. So I suppose in a way, I'm about to unwrap when I said it's not really a platform. Well, perhaps I can see it is an opportunity, perhaps, to get some other messaging across, which I think some of the charities, particularly Royal British Legion, do. And yes, there are a lot of, it isn't just about commemorating those who sadly gave the ultimate sacrifice. It is also a moment to consider others who have other challenges in life through their service. So I think it's right, but I don't think that should become sort of a dominant thing about it. But it's just perhaps one of those natural things. If people are going to think, well, gosh, they see on the television the cenotaph, and that makes them reflect a bit. And then there's a lot more messaging around the wider experiences and the suffering and frankly the challenges that in mental health or other disabilities that some of our armed forces veterans have. So I suppose it's a natural thing, even if it's not dedicated to be a platform to do that. It's just a reality that it can be used like that.
And I think that the Remembrance Day itself, or particularly that week in November, it serves to remind us that the way we look after our veterans and their families in this country has always been a partnership between the services, those things that we do for ourselves, the charitable sector, and the state. And the Remembrance event is an opportunity to remind the state that they have to hold up their end of the log, to encourage people to give to charity, and to allow the services to set up what they do for their veterans. And we should recognise we've been very lucky for about a generation in that we really haven't had to deal with mass casualties. And 453 roughly fatalities in Afghanistan was less than a morning's casualties in the First and in some cases in the Second World War. So the numbers we're dealing with are very much smaller from a population of 67 million. So we absolutely ought to be doing a gleaming job of looking after our veterans and their families. But then we should also remember that the possibility of going to war in the future where we deal with mass casualties again, it seems unlikely, but as the world turns and technology changes, in a world not least of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, we need to think about that again. So we shouldn't think the consequences of war are small just because of our recent experience.
And I completely agree. And actually, I would also bring in one other consideration. It's actually, I think it's entirely appropriate, how appropriate it is for Britain, for this country. We're used to this level. And I've actually been to some other countries. It's quite interesting seeing how others do it. And I was in Germany, in Wilhelmshaven, one in a ship visit at the time of Remembrance Sunday. And I think the experience in America is different. I mean, there's much more, it becomes a bigger issue. And yet other countries in Europe, it's much less than the way we do it in UK. I think the way we do it in the UK is appropriate for our culture, our history, and it's something which we reflect on and we'll be proud of. Other countries go for it even bigger, but others it's less. But then there are other sort of historical reasons why that's the case.
It's very binding, isn't it? I mean, as I watch my children march through the local high street, there's obviously a solemnity. There's a slight sense of jubilee about it, and there's a very, very great sense of coming together for me as a civilian, as I'm perhaps not as much as a veteran, but in a similar kind of way. So, I mean, when it comes back to that sense of respect, it does seem to work for society that we do this.
There is a danger with Remembrance that, and this is partly born out of the public feeling around the Iraq and Afghan wars, which is that the armed forces are seen somehow as victims, when they're not. There are victims and casualties of war, but the armed forces themselves They exist to protect the country, and sometimes that is going to be necessary, and it will be hard. But we have volunteer armed forces. We don't do conscription, and if we worked ourselves up to a point where, because we were so afeared of the consequences of fighting, that we could not imagine any consequences when we would need to fight, then we would find our values and our interests as a country put in serious jeopardy. And the armed forces don't want to be seen as victims. They want to be seen as what they are, which are an institution to protect the country. And sometimes where Remembrance can go off the rails is where it just focuses on this sense of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines as victims, and it's a lot more than that.
James, that's your special area, isn't it? I mean, is there sometimes a sense within TechVets that, I mean, to put it very crudely, it kind of helps that the armed forces can be victims, can be portrayed as victims, or are you much more front foot about the way you market their services to cybersecurity?
100% front foot. And I think that's where we're slightly different with many of the organisations that we work with. I think, certainly as part of RFEA, the main reason that we came together was we had a very shared perspective on how to support people into employment post-military careers. And I think one of the big chances that we have is to get across the strengths and the experiences, the skills and the incredible character traits that so many of these men and women have. And I think, again, as Sir Richard said, we can sometimes be lost in this whole narrative that there are people that are so vulnerable and need help. And quite frankly, that sets the wrong tone. There are some, but the message has to be clear. We have people that have incredible experience within their military service. And generally speaking, that's something that can add value to society. As we've seen on every time there's a crisis, it adds value to communities, it adds value to business and the economy. And I think that's the importance that I always place on the members within TechVets community, is that they are a value add. And there are other organisations out there that can provide support to those that are in a vulnerable state.
Alistair, how does the RFEA cope with this?
Completely agree. I mean, it's absolutely key thing. And without doubt, over the years, there's been, from time to time with sort of certain television programs, sometimes the news media, there have been some times when, there's been a depiction of people who serve, they're going to have some sort of issues, Afghan flashbacks. And it is really counterproductive. And so our liaison with our employers, and we've got relationship with about 9,500 companies across the UK, it is all about, tapping into this incredible talent of people who have served in the armed forces, the skills they've got, the resilience, the team skills, the leadership, management, all of these other great things, which makes them attractive. So my pitch is always is same as Sir Richard and James as well. You don't have to feel sorry for people who have served. They're not victims. And even people who have actually got more challenging things, they'll still be very good for a company, for an employer in your market, in your workplace, good for the bottom line. And we've got countless cases of people who've been really quite badly injured, recovered, have gone into companies and done incredibly well. So it's not a case of, they're there to feel sorry for. Having said that, there are some who are more vulnerable and then do need more support, whether it's into employment or to other parts of their life. And we've got a lot of mechanisms and a lot of support networks to do exactly that. But that should not remove the main message about people who've been in the armed forces have a great experiences of their service, which they then put to tremendous use in their civilian jobs.
Yeah. The vulnerability part that I see is that with some careers, you can't just do a very short course at the end of your resettlement period and think you can land this whole career change. So it's a vulnerable period because you've been in an institution which, quite frankly, sometimes is quite removed from the sort of business world in the terminology and some of the practices and processes, the systems being used, etc. So I think the bit that we focus on, if there is any vulnerability, is making sure that those individuals leaving the military have a really good understanding of what they need to do and what supports they can get from the likes of TechVets, RFEA, etc., to help them make that jump a little bit easier.
So I think there are two tragic vulnerabilities attached to the way people are taken up into civilian employment when they leave. The first is many good people who've really thrived in the services and have a huge amount to offer. They have character, experience, self-discipline, leadership, an ethos you don't find in every walk of life. But what they don't have is any sense of how the commercial world works, because they probably joined at about 17 or 18 years old. And the first tragedy I see is where you have really good people, typically, for example, a warrant officer who has commanded men in difficult situations, ends up thinking that they should man a gate or drive a lorry or do something that doesn't use a third of their skill set because they can't find the way in. And the equal and opposite side of the fence are civilian employers who have no personal understanding of the military. And what little they do have is from a film like Saving Private Ryan or the Blackadder series from the 1980s. And they struggle to think about, well, how could someone who's like that, quote unquote, fit into my business? And we need to do everything we can to bridge that gap. And one way of bridging the gap, which TechVets does very successfully, is to give people the skills for the digital age that align with all the other qualities and then introduce them to employers. And I think our collective experience is quite often where we introduce one military person as the first into a commercial enterprise, they are simply blown away with what they contribute. And then they would like some more. And people who have joined to do quite basic things quite quickly end up running the show. And that's as it should be. I mean, there are only 140,000 regulars, and there are about another 40,000 reserves in a country of 67 million people. So if even a third of the armed forces leave every year, frankly, employers should be fighting amongst themselves to hire them.
Alistair, what do you find? Is that the case in your world?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going through a very interesting period at the moment. I mean, I say post-COVID, if we're actually getting to that. Right now, a lot of employers, most employers, are crying out for veterans. They're crying out for more labour, more. I mean, the number of vacancies today is at record numbers for the last 20 years. So we couldn't. Amazing. 12 months ago. Certainly during most of last year, in the midst of sort of the COVID thing, it was looking the other way. We're forecasting high unemployment. A lot of vacancies have been taken off. I mean, companies were not recruiting, and a lot of sectors were really down. A lot of sectors did very well, and certainly including the tech cyber area, and that's where TechVets has been so brilliant in keeping a sort of steady flow of veterans going into that industry. But actually, what's happened now is quite interesting. So I worry now that we could be at some stage in the future, we could go back to this issue of if at the moment the supply of veterans, if you like, to the marketplace, to the jobs is reduced because the numbers aren't there and there are more job vacancies. Some of these companies can then say, okay, well, we're not bothered then about veterans, we'll have to go elsewhere. And then a year's time, it could be the other way around. We could have a surplus of people wanting to find jobs. So right now we're in it, probably because of the economy, possibly a bit of Brexit, but certainly about COVID, I think the impact. Right now, it's a slightly unusual position to be in. And obviously during COVID, many people they stayed in, they didn't leave. So there was a reduction in, people would take their notices out if they were going to leave, a lot of extensions of services. That's about to change now. I think more will be starting to leave again. And right now, there are a lot of job vacancies in the market and across various sectors. But we don't know how long that will carry on for.
The fear I have, and as Sir Richard highlighted, is the underemployed. Because if someone's going to be unemployed, sometimes you just can't avoid it. That's maybe an individual that's gone down a route that at some point there was something that just didn't click, or they didn't plan correctly. I think the underemployment is an easier one to catch a larger number of people, and that's to educate them on their own values as well, on the skills that they have in their service. Because, as Sir Richard said, we have people coming out now who will follow those traditional pathways. We had Luke. In fact, Alistair and I spoke to Luke on the RFEA podcast, and it was it was great to have him on to discuss how he'd gone from being a tank driver, natural route, into being an HGV driver because he had his HGV license. But until he had that someone to just flick the switch, provide him that sort of bit of motivation, that bit of confidence to go for something different, he then went down a route that was into a technical career as a cyber consultant. But it's really difficult to do because you get, at the moment, it's still a slightly archaic process that you have this year to leave. And when you get to the end of that year, you've been proactively walking towards unemployment at that point. You've got to try and find a job at the end of the year. And when you do so, if you have a family, which most do by the time they leave, there is incredible risk that you're just not going to be able to find a job that doesn't put food on the table, pay the bills. So it's then trying to get in there early enough to showcase to them the skills they have. And again, it's a wonderful cycle. We educate companies, industries, sectors on the values of veteran skills. At the same time, getting those businesses to showcase how they understand the values, so the service leavers and veterans start to get that confidence that the business want them. And it's a wonderful cycle, and that kind of serves itself to an extent. But it's really challenging. But the point that Sir Richard made is in that area where, regardless of how many opportunities we have, how people see veterans, there will always be a desire to employ people out of the military, and that is in operational management and delivery, where people have this wonderful ability to work with multidisciplinary skills. Even in tech, where technology is wonderfully important, there is a lot of people management that needs to happen, and there's a huge gap there. Understanding processes and systems, being able to think on your feet. And we've seen it in the pandemic. For many of us, we had an almost jesting conversation about it being like a wonderful operational tour. The operational tour bonus was the fact we weren't paying for a train ticket, but we also had our fridge and our family in the same room as us, as we were hunkering down in isolation. And I think the way that we approach something chaotic, a crisis, is different. It's calm, it's manageable, and it makes everyone else feel confident. And I think that is something that's been brought out quite nicely in the pandemic. And I speak to a number of employers, as I'm sure Alistair has probably, by the power of 10, who really respect that aspect coming out of the military.
And we should recognise that veterans come in many different sizes, shapes, and ages. So we probably focus most on the 20-somethings who have solid military service, but an awful lot of life ahead of them, and need to retrain and find another career. And then there's another market, which I think are the 30-somethings and the 40-somethings who have probably got more solid leadership experience in many cases behind them. And with the right development, those are the sorts of people that can run your company if you take them on. They need a start, and they need to learn in many cases a new way of working in a new language, but they have an enormous amount to offer. And then there is the slightly grayer market, the 55-year-olds. Now, perhaps a decade ago, when they left at 55, most thought they were going to retire. Now, almost without exception, they're going to work for at least another 15 years. We're all going to do that. And that market is, it's just as important to recognize the skills and talents that they can bring to an employer as it is the 20-something. And perhaps Remembrance is an opportunity to think about the full span of the veteran market, as well as remember the things that military service heaps on some people.
Right, we're guilty of turning our Remembrance podcast into a platform for other things. Can I just round this up with perhaps a personal thought? So Richard, where will you spend Remembrance this year, given that last year was beset by COVID and we couldn't really attend anything?
So we're back out there. I shall be in London. I shall be as a gunner. I will be at the Royal Regiment of Artillery Remembrance Parade, which is held at Hyde Park Corner. And that year, when the traffic is stopped around Hyde Park Corner, but which is a mark of the significance. And when I go there, I will think about the million gunners that served in the Second World War, and the similar number that served in the First World War. And then I will think about the people I served with over 30 or 40 years that have suffered or didn't make it back. and then I shall have a reunion with my mates.
Alistair, former Commodore, where will you be?
Yeah, I mean, this year I'm being privileged to be able to go to the Festival of Remembrance on the Saturday evening, which I really look forward to. It's a very moving event, and it's the one which is broadcast, and many people sort of see that. So that's what we'll be doing on the Saturday. A week before that, I've got several slots collecting for Royal British Legion in our local Sainsbury's, which I do enjoy, and I've done it for quite a few years now. Not just because it's the right thing to do and I enjoy it, but you actually see an awful lot of people, and it's quite nice for them to, have to catch up and talk a bit about it to some of my civilian friends. And then on the morning itself, I will just be in our local church, and there is a small service at the end of it for about 50 to 100 or so people, which is quite small and intimate. But so I'm not going at the moment to one of the bigger ones, and I'm quite happy to be, after spending many years around going to remembrance things in various ports and around the world or whatever. I'm quite happy to be doing it at home now. It's quite nice. I remember one year I was in the Isle of Man laying a wreath, and it was about Force 8, and there's in Douglas there's the cenotaph or the war memorial is right by the seafront, and it was just wind. We're all in greatcoats. Memorable. And sometimes I think about these other places where I've been to, and having seen that, and I've done it once in Manchester when I was captain of HMS Manchester. So it's a time to reflect on all the other places. That moment around the country, everyone is doing it in their own different way, but I do look forward to it.
It is very important for us civilians to have veterans at our church services locally. And where I am, we've just lost our last World War II veteran, and I mean, until recently we had 3 of them, which was it was almost like it was a tick for us, which was tremendous. But James, how about you? What are you going to do?
As always, Charlie, I'm fairly fast, light and loose. I've got a number of different events that I may be attending over the course of that week. And it's going to be a busy time where I'm going to be catching up with a number of different groups of people and close friends as well. I think I still have a lot of friends that are still serving. We've lost people since from things like PTSD and the likes, where suicide has kicked in. So for me, it's still very raw. With a number of still quite close groups, and at the same time, I've got my 2 boys, so we will do something meaningful to make sure that they have an enjoyable day and see the real positive aspect of it, as to why we should still be remembering every year.
So Richard, Alistair, James, thank you for joining us. For our listeners, you can find out more about TechVets and how to become a member by visiting techvets.co or searching for TechVets on LinkedIn. If you are a business owner or work for a company in the tech industry and want to find out how to get more veterans into your team, drop James Murphy a message via LinkedIn. You'll find all the contacts you need in the description for this post. We'll be back next month with another TechVets podcast. Thanks for joining us.